A transparent system of government accountable to citizens, giving effect to one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. This is what Chapter 9 institutions are meant to do. But is that what they're doing? Who will watch the watchers? Who will guard the guardians? Let's get started. Well, a very good evening and welcome to the Democracy Gauge. I'm Bongani Bingwa. Now, according to the Bill of Rights, government has a duty to ensure that every South African is treated fairly. But also, the issue is that citizens need never fear the leaders they elect to serve them. And that's why today we are focusing on the Chapter 9 institutions. Because of the corrupting nature of power, we certainly have enough examples from our past to show us that quite often citizens are afraid of their leaders. So Chapter 9 institutions were established to entrench the rights of South Africans under the Constitution. And so that's why we're having the conversation this evening. Now, we've got issues, challenges, duplication of functions, limited budgets, questions of independence and access for ordinary citizens. These are the challenges that have bedeviled these institutions. Most importantly, we have to ask, do they in fact have teeth? And that leads us to our poll question for tonight. Are Chapter 9 institutions playing their role in society? You can choose from our three colors. Green is for yes, yellow maybe, red is for no. And of course, you can interact with our poll topic on Facebook and Twitter. Remember our hashtags, SABCDG25 and SABC News. We also welcome your WhatsApp videos, 065-862-4548. So our producer, Lindiwe Mabena, probes then this issue of whether Chapter 9 institutions are as effective as they ought to be.
25 years on, while the quality of life for the black majority largely remains dire, constitutional democracy has given them a voice and improved access to opportunities. It also guarantees every citizen's right to socio-economic justice, dignity, and respect. These institutions exist to ensure that South Africa's hard-won democratic rights are protected and attained.
They've been set up for the most vulnerable in our society and for the citizens. And we cannot afford for them to fall by the wayside.
The IEC, Human Rights Commission, and the Auditor General's Office are some of the organizations that have been credited with sterling work.
The Auditor General's Office, again, is a critically important office, and it's been really important in exposing, at local government level, at provincial government level, at all levels of government, some of the maladministration, or a lot of the maladministration that has been going on. Now, it remains to be seen whether the new powers that it has been given will make it an effective enforcer, if you like, of its findings. The Human Rights Commission, we've had good dealings with the Human Rights Commission. It seems to be an effective institution.
But Vali is concerned that there's little public knowledge on whether the Human Rights Commission has been keeping the executive in check as mandated. He says civil society oversight will help ensure that the public is always kept on the loop.
The Constitution directly says that departments must report annually to the Human Rights Commission on very fundamental socioeconomic rights, health, education, water, food, social security, even the environment. The Constitution itself says so. Is this happening? Has this been enforced? And why isn't the executive complying?
The work of this office led to the State Capture Commission, which is aimed at cleansing one of post-apartheid South Africa's darkest stains. But its credibility is sadly washing away. The Public Protector's Office has been under fire since 2017, with various quarters accusing Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane of incompetence and dishonesty. The state of that office has pushed Parliament to develop a procedure to remove heads of Chapter 9 institutions. Lewis and Valley say while this is a step in the right direction, caution is needed.
You don't want to have a situation where it's too easy to remove the heads of one of those officers. You really don't.
There must be provision to remove people, but not willy-nilly, not at the whim of a political party.
Vali says while Chapter 9 institutions have previously played significant roles in ensuring social justice, they need to be more visible.
They have to be the first responders to human rights violations. You know, we've had these issues of GBV and xenophobia. We needed to hear their voice.
While efforts continue to ensure that people of unquestionable integrity lead these critical institutions, concerns remain over the lack of a standard, transparent and merit-based process. Lindio Mapena, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Thank you to our Lindiwe Mabena. Well, joining the conversation in studio with me now is former IEC chairperson Dr. Brigelia Bam and advocate Sheldon Magadi from a non-profit public interest law clinic, the Legal Resources Centre. Thank you both for joining us this evening. The key question we are trying to address is, are the Chapter 9 institutions working well for our people? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? I'll start with you, Dr. Bam.
Yes, indeed. My own experience with these institutions, experience of 14 years when I also worked very closely and I was part of a Chapter 9 institution myself through the Electoral Commission. Excellent work they are doing. Doesn't get enough publicity because the cases they handle are not the cases that attract necessarily the media. And so that is really one of the challenges, is that people get to know more or less what these institutions are doing when there is a crisis or exciting news. And there's a lot of work also that they do with what we would call ordinary citizens of South Africa who go to their offices. We do not know the numbers of the people, and the institutions are accountable to Parliament. And as you know, our Parliament doesn't have a system of reporting back in a formal sense to the public about all the kinds of issues that they handle. One of the challenges has been for many, many years now for Chapter 9 institutions has been the question of funding. Because as long as institutions are attached to government departments and they have to struggle to share whatever is left from a particular department of government for the budget. And that remains the biggest challenge for most of the Chapter 9 institutions. Some, of course, get to be known, like the Electoral Commission, every South African, but they participate, which makes it easy, because every citizen of South Africa will get to know about the elections, so that puts it at an advantage. The Auditor General is one institution that is working all over the country, covering most of the government institutions, going to local government and meeting councillors. But for the reason, perhaps, except there's something exciting in the news, people don't even know what is going on.
Well, let me pick you up on the Auditor General.
Yes.
Advocate Magadi, I mean, it's difficult to argue with Dr. Bam based on her experience at the IEC. But as she points out, budgeting is an issue, funding is an issue. Let's talk about the Auditor General. Year after year, the Auditor General will tell us about fruitless and wasteful expenditure, municipalities not meeting basic audit requirements. But does that office have teeth to enforce some of the issues it flags year in, year out?
Well, certainly, I think if one looks at the legislation, not just in relation to the Auditor General, but in relation to the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, I don't think one can conclude that any of these Chapter 9 institutions do not have teeth. They clearly have legislative tools that empower them to make recommendations and to ensure that those recommendations are followed through. I think the starting point is important, and the starting point is that what the Constitution says is that the purpose of these institutions is to strengthen constitutional democracy. And strengthening constitutional democracy not only includes making sure that a democracy is open, accountable and transparent, but also in relation to the other institutions, ensuring that human rights are protected and enforced. In relation to the Auditor General, what one must take into account is that the mandate of the Auditor General is prescribed in the Constitution, it is prescribed in legislation, but importantly, the execution of its recommendations in many instances requires the involvement of another organ of state. In the same way that the judiciary, for example, can make an order and the implementation of that order requires enforcement by another organ of state. So certainly the answer to your question is that they do have teeth, and the extent to which those teeth are actually biting does not only depend on those Chapter 9 institutions.
But it often appears that a lot of this requires the goodwill of some of the people that are involved in the matters a number of these institutions take up. Let's take the case of the South African Human Rights Commission, for example. It began investigating the collapse of cancer services in public hospitals in KZN. It took 2 years for the MEC who was responsible to even appear before the Human Rights Commission, and when he did, he testified for only 10 minutes. It's things like that that for people who are at the coalface of that experience, they watch it and they think, this isn't working for us. Dr. Bam.
Well, I'm glad you're giving that as an example also of the limitations that these institutions have. You see, you have to rely as a Chapter 9 institution in a method of persuading people. You are relying on that because you can't force people. We don't have a mechanism for that. We don't have a mechanism where you can go and report an official on anything that they do not have. We don't operate, it doesn't operate in that way. So you are relying...
Doesn't that suggest a weakness then, Dr. Bam?
Well, yes, partly because, you see, we are accountable, all of them are accountable to Parliament. That's the first thing. And accountable Parliament means that you are lucky when you do actually go to Cape Town to submit your report, that you will be able to get the full time, the quality time that is needed for people to be able to raise all the challenges that it is facing so that we can actually make changes. One of the challenges is that, you see, our constitution has been very difficult, as you know, to implement many things in it in the 25 years because it's broad and the responsibilities are broad. And the people who have a responsibility for all of us, the departments, Chapter 9 institutions, name it, it's Parliament. And simple, the time they give to those kinds of things is very difficult.
The other issue when you bring up the issue of Parliament is, of course, who gets to be deployed to fill vacancies in these commissions to begin with. One will raise questions, for example, about the governing party and how its deployment committees often are the ones that decide who fills positions in these commissions, and yet we expect those very same people to go back and hold those politicians to account. It doesn't always work, does it?
Yes, no, absolutely. The commission that was chaired by the late Professor Carter Asmal made some important recommendations regarding the appointment process for Chapter 9 institutions. One must also bear in mind that the Constitution itself specifies the procedure that has to be followed. For example, the nomination of persons to these commissions has to be through a multi-party process. There are special majorities that are required in relation to certain types of appointment. But there's one critical aspect which I believe is sometimes underplayed, which is that the Constitution also specifies that civil society must be involved in the process of nomination and recommendations to the appointments to Chapter 9 institutions. So certainly public involvement is an important mechanism for ensuring accountability in itself.
You mentioned the Carter Asmal report, which suggested that 5 out of the 8 should be merged into one. So the next question is, do we even need all of them? We'll continue with our conversation. And of course, after the break, we're keen to get your views at home on whether the Chapter 9 institutions are playing their role in the society as they ought to. Stay with us. Welcome back. It's all about you here on the Democracy Gauge. Now, the People's View allows you to interact with us. So let's find out what some of you have had to say via the WhatsApps you've been sending.
Chapter 9 institution is not playing their role, is failing us as South Africans.
Chapter 9 organizations or Chapter 9 institutions they are not really doing their work. You see, most of the time here in South Africa, you have to report things like racism and so forth, even if they are out there done in the public. However, I think they should have been proactive and begin to do things on their own. Look at CRL. Now it's getting a backlash because all along it hasn't been doing its work and it has gone into oblivion for some time.
We're continuing our conversation with the former IEC chairperson, Dr. Brigalia Bam, and Advocate Sheldon Magadi from the Legal Resources Centre. We're asking the question this evening, are these Chapter 9 institutions doing their work? And as both of you have seen, at least from the WhatsApp comments that we are getting, not many citizens are convinced. The other issue that I want to raise now is how often these watchdogs depend on the quality of the leadership that they have at the helm. And, it seems to me that quite often it's the leadership and the willingness of people to do their work. Advocate Magadi.
The leadership is important because one must ultimately remember that the work of these Chapter 9 institutions ultimately is to ensure that human rights are protected, which is a very practical thing. Let me give one particular example. One of the recommendations of the ASMAL report was that there should be an obligation on each and every Chapter 9 institution to produce disaggregated statistical data regarding the number of complaints it's received, the time taken to process those complaints, and the outcome of those complaints. Because obviously without that information, one is unable to assess how long does it take for a complaint to the Human Rights Commission to be resolved. And without that, the consequence of it is that it ultimately leads to the legitimacy of those institutions being questioned by the public, as your viewers have indicated.
It also raises questions around their effectiveness. One of the things I raised before we went to the break was exactly what that ASMAL report recommended in terms of merging some of these commissions into a bigger body. I mean, do we need all of them? Aren't there instances, Dr. Bam, where there's a duplication of processes and responsibilities?
The tradition of Chapter 9 institutions is that if there is a particular problem that people are handling or a complaint of any kind, they will always check whether in fact they are the ones who should handle it. And if you look at the Human Rights and you look at the Gender Commission, of course there's a tendency of those things. If you're dealing with issues of violence as one case, any of the two can handle them, depending if you're talking about the violence against children or you're talking about the violence against women, whatever. So there is always a contact between these institutions. You don't simply take a case and you handle it and then they assess them. And every one of these Chapter 9 institutions have a unique role. And to be able to put everybody all in one big basket, good heavens, I can assure you that it will never work, because there are those that have a higher profile, bigger budgets, large numbers of staff than the others. And then there are those that have staff that are smaller in numbers, less budget. And then there is also a fundamental problem of the independence of these institutions. Yeah. It is very difficult for these institutions, in every case, to be always independent, because somehow, directly or indirectly, you are accountable to a minister, directly or indirectly, because you have to get your budget through a ministry. And that doesn't help in the process of trying to do things yourself. Talking about the leadership, you see, it is teamwork. In any work you do of this nature, there's no way that a leader can do. It just depends on the kind of people that you want. Yeah. Whether you are able, in fact, to pay their salaries, or you recruit the kind of competencies and you can afford them. And that is always a limitation with this, because there are people who would rather not work for these institutions with all the training they have, with the ability they have, because there just isn't the kind of budget that will attract a kind of person that you want at a given time.
Let's talk about ministers and the executive in particular. I mean, it seems also that part of the problem people will flag is that quite often it depends on the willingness of people in government to do what the institutions sometimes require them to do. We've seen a number of examples with the public protector, for example, going back to the predecessor of Busisiwe Mkhwebane, and even she would argue in some instances she's had difficulty to get the executive to follow through on her remedial action. Yes. How do we deal with that?
I think the starting point is to emphasize that compliance with the constitutional obligation is not really a question of choice. The Constitution makes it crystal clear that all organs of state must assist these Chapter 9 institutions in order to ensure that they are effective. So it's not a question of whether a particular organ of state or an executive or a functionary in the executive arm of government has a choice as to whether to comply with a particular recommendation. I would argue it's a constitutional obligation in itself. The problem, and I think it's important to be clear about this, that the problem seems to be that the accountability must lie both in relation to the Chapter 9 and in relation to Parliament. For example, approximately 14 years ago, the Human Rights Commission conducted an inquiry into human rights violations on farms. One of the points that it made was that there was a serious delay in the processing of labour tenant applications. That recommendation was placed before Parliament. Parliament had a duty to ensure that the executive accounted for it. Absolutely nothing was done about it. It was only some 14 years later, in August this year, that the Constitutional Court ruled in the Mwelase matter that there was a gross violation of human rights, and I would suggest that part of the responsibility for that must be placed at the door of the Chapter 9 institution and at the door of Parliament.
I mean, that's essentially the question. Who will speak for the voiceless? I mean, that's what these institutions were set up to do. As we wrap up our conversation then, perhaps a very quick comment from both of you. We've obviously had challenges along the way these last 25 years, but overall, I mean, if the framers of the Constitution could see what we know now, would they still have chosen these instruments?
Personally, I would say that one of the things that we need to do is that after 25 years, because after all, we have only been a nation for a very short time. And it is very difficult to measure, actually, across the country on a number of things, the impact that some of these institutions are able to make because of the time factor and the fact that 25 years is in fact a short time because of all that has gone on before us. And it seems though to me that time probably has come for us to begin to review these institutions and see how best we can improve their performance and give them different kind of support and make sure that they are independent, because this is very, very important, and make sure that they are made to be effective. As long as you do not have provisions in the law of doing certain things, you see, Parliament has got to deal with the whole nation. And the agenda of the members of Parliament, with due respect to them, is the biggest agenda you can imagine. And so there will always be items in the agenda of a nation that, maybe Chapter 9 institution is the last item on the agenda.
Look, it's an ongoing conversation, as you say, Dr. Bam. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this afternoon. Thank you very much for that conversation. Right, through the Democracy Gauge, as you know, the SABC profiles a different South African. After the break, we'll take a look at today's profile and let you know why. Stay with us. Well, among the millions of South Africans who voted for the very first time in 1994 was one Sarah Mahlangu. She was incredibly excited to exercise this right. 84 years old from Vezubuhle in Mpumalanga. She hasn't been able to walk in the last 4 years, and this disability makes it difficult as she takes care of her grandchildren.
Amanzi maningi akhona mhlana ngekho awakho mara awona ahlala khona nasipompi msangithi ngiyamanzi unahlala khona nasakhambile akakhambile ukuthi maraza kubuya nesikontiri nasibasifakile ngithi sekuthi ke mina kangisakhambi ngimuntu ongasakhona ukuhamba nokusikimuka ngikhoni ngiyesaba ukuthi ngizakuwa nangisikimela ngiyesaba ukuthi ngizakuwa kahle ngihlele phasa pha kodwa mara anganapha kubuhlungu khona so net into esengibhalile ukuhamba amadolo la ngiyesaba ukuthi ngizakuwa ngiyesaba ukuthi ngathi nangisikimela ngiduleke phasi kusukuthi kodwa akusimnandi u-94 ngiyakhumbula mara ngisazi ukuthi kwenzekani ngiyakhumbula mara ukuthi wavontelwa kokuthoma abana aphume bajabulile bajabule stereki nakuyokuvota kokuthoma angithi bese simbona emaphephini ukuthi nangumandela mara sambona-ke very good le mara zange simbone ngenyama kuye sambona sasesinande simbone emaphephini unyaka lo iye ngivotile iye sekuphela nakho kuyaphela nakho iye ngivotile unyaka lo iye ngabona ikolo siyijamile ngihlezi ngapha ngemva ngikhasa ngibuya ngetoilet ongihleli ikolo sakhwela sakuvota iye sabe uyabuya ngibuyisa ikoloni iye sifuna ubulele sobuphunguleke bulele sobona buphunguleke iye ethi ngazi buzakuphunguka kanjani mara mntu enhle kakhani ukuthi bulele sobuphunguleke iye hawu siyahola sinamanzi nekontiri zikhona epateni apha iye.
Right, before we say goodbye, let's take a look then at the results for today's poll. There are the numbers coming up on your screen. The yeses are at 22%, 60% of you say no. So not many of us convinced they are doing what they are supposed to. But as Dr. Bump perhaps says that we need more time. We're still a young democracy. From me, Bongani Bingwa, and the rest of the Democracy Gauge team, until the next time, ubusuku benzolo. Good night.